spent an hour on my first line of my book because that's the line that's going to make people decide whether they want to read the next line.
Welcome to Everybody Pulls the Tarp, the go-to podcast for high performers. I'm Andrew Moses, and each week I talk with Olympians, pro athletes, TV stars, Grammy winners, best-selling authors, CEOs, and other high performers to uncover their success secrets. Every conversation is jam-packed with inspiration and actionable ideas we all can apply to our own lives, personally and professionally. Get ready for a behind-the-scenes look at the techniques, processes, and mindsets powering the world's most successful people. Let's go. This week, my guest is USA Today bestselling author Jenny Hale. When Jenny was in college, a friend said this about Jenny: "Look out for this one. She's going to be an author one day." Well, Jenny eventually proved that friend right. But first, Jenny began her career as an elementary school teacher, teaching 18 years in public school, including 11 years teaching ESL to young kids, while also helping to create the entire ESL program and curriculum. She began writing as a creative outlet and wrote a book, which she says never saw the light of day. But writing that book set her on a path that would change her life and career forever. Jenny followed her curiosity and began studying her favorite authors and the craft of writing more deeply. And then in 2013, she wrote and published a novel called Coming Home for Christmas, and it was a massive success. Today, Jenny is the author of more than 20 books, including 2 which have now been turned into Hallmark original movies. Her books have sold over 1 million copies worldwide and have been translated into multiple languages. But as you'll hear in our conversation, for Jenny, writing books is just a part of the equation. Jenny also founded and leads her own publishing imprint, Harpeth Road, where she helps other authors reach their dreams as well. The conversation you are about to hear is about creativity, entrepreneurship, the power of curiosity, and so much more. Jenny's story is absolutely inspiring, and I hope you take away as much from it as I have. So, let's pull the tarp and get straight to Jenny Hale. Jenny, I can't wait to dig into your story. Where I want to begin, so back in college, a friend says about you, look out for this one. She is going to be an author one day. I'm curious, what do you think it was specifically about you that gave that friend the premonition that you'd become an author one day?
The funny thing about that is I have no idea. I've met with her for coffee later and we've talked a little bit about it, but I haven't actually asked what made her say that. I mean, I always liked to write, and I teased that in college, if I could get through on just writing papers, I would be a straight A student. I just always loved to write. I wrote poetry and dabbled in it, but the idea of being a professional author never occurred to me until I was about, I don't even know, like a career deep in public education and looking for a creative outlet.
At the time, was this friend a close friend? Was it an acquaintance, somebody that spent a lot of time around you?
Yeah.
Or was it somebody who was more distant that saw something maybe in a class or in an interaction? Like, tell me about that.
No, this was a good friend of mine. She was actually a sorority sister of mine in college. And I think we were doing our senior send-offs or something when she said that. But it was so out there at the time that I was like, what? What? She saw it before I did, really.
That happens a lot of times. I think people around us see things and see possibilities before we ourselves see them, which I think is such a fascinating element of your story. So that was kind of where the first little itty bitty idea was planted in your mind that, Now, you went on to have a career in education. You worked as an elementary school teacher for 18 years, taught in public schools, spent the last 11 years teaching ESL to young kids, where you created programming, wrote curriculum. What about talking about the teaching path and the public educator path? Was that something that always was kind of in line with your expectations and what you wanted to do?
I grew up in a small town and then later moved to county, which was the big time. And then I grew up with very traditional parents who just, you were on that track. You get good grades, you go to college, you get a degree in something, you work really hard, and eventually you retire. I was a creative though, and I didn't really understand my options as a creative. So I did all the things. I went to college, I got a master's of ed. I liked teaching because it appealed to my creative side. I never in 18 years did I ever use a teacher's manual, ever once. I created every lesson just on my own based on what my kids needed. And I really liked that. But it wasn't quite the fit for me, even though I did it for 18 years. The kids loved me. I loved the kids. I had a good rapport with all the people at school, but there just was something. I remember just sitting around thinking, like, is this it? Like, this is what we do? We do this until we're so old we can't do it anymore. And so it was only then that I decided I needed to do something. So just for fun, I started to write a book, and I don't even know what prompted me to do that of all things, because I love graphic design and I take photos and I dabble in painting and I love home interiors, and there's all kinds of creative outlets for me, but the writing just happened to be the one that I tried at that moment. And that's how I
Was there a moment like you talked about there, like feeling like you started to begin to wonder, like, is this it? Is this what I'm supposed to be feeling? Is this what I'm supposed to be doing? Like, was that something that became so pervasive, in your mind that you just couldn't ignore it? Like, what led you to then kind of pursue the writing as a creative outlet? Just we'll get to the writing career and the career as an author and novelist and now publisher. But what led you to just pursue writing a book on your own laptop as a creative outlet?
It was literally one moment. I was sitting next to my husband. I read all the time. I was reading women's, some rom-com or something at the time. And I looked at him and I said, I think I could write one of these. I have no idea what possessed me to think that I could do that, because I had zero understanding of how to write a novel. But I did it. I said, I just think I could write one of these. And he knows that I'm just crazy enough to try. So he said, well, go for it if you want to write one. And so for night after night after night, I sat in my little area with his laptop, because back then I didn't even have a laptop. And he does finance for a living. So I had his big laptop with the number pad on the side. And I just started to write a story, and it was awful. It was terrible. It never saw the light of day. I think I did one of those weird little options where you could just basically put a cover on it and like hand it out to your friends, and it was awful. But then when I went back to writing, I started to see what I was doing, because when I started to read again, it kind of ruined my reading experience, because now whenever I read fiction, it's like I'm having an unwritten conversation with the author instead of actually writing or reading the book. I'm noticing when they're pulling their conflict in and how they're starting their paragraphs and the grammar they're using and all the things. But in doing that, I started to figure out, oh, like I did this wrong and I did this wrong, but I had done it. I'd done a whole book. So then I started to read books on writing, and it just snowballed like that, where it was just like one random moment. And then it just kept going, and I was enjoying it versus the teaching part that I'd been doing for years and years and years. I could do it with my eyes shut. So this was sort of a new frontier for my brain, for creativity. And so I started reading books on how to develop characters and how to carry the plot through. And I just started devouring all of these books at the bookstore. And I wrote a second book. And that book was the one that changed my career.
It sure did, Jenny. And I'm curious, going back to that first book, the one you're writing on your husband's laptop with the keypad on the side, ultimately, aside from like realizing that it was somewhat exhilarating and energizing for you as compared to what you were doing at the time, which had become a little bit more mundane and kind of pattern driven, what did you enjoy the most about just thinking about like that experience from start to finish, writing that book, what did you enjoy most? And then secondly, what maybe surprised you the most about that experience?
What I enjoyed most was just the wild freedom. I mean, I come from public education where everything is scripted and laid out. And so I had that very sort of left brain side of me where everything was labeled, color coded. I was an elementary school teacher, so it looked like Pinterest threw up in my classroom. Everything was just perfect. And when you're writing a novel, it's just an empty page. And so for the first time in my life, I had to try to put parameters on nothing. I had just an empty void that I had to build something in. And I really, really loved that. And that proved true for me in terms of my personality and how I ended up in publishing. But I really loved that sort of wide open space. And then the biggest aha moment for me was when I tried to get someone to look at it. I got a lot. I mean, you tell people when you've never been an author, you have no background in it whatsoever, and you tell random people in your life, or not even people that you know very well, that you wrote a novel, you just naturally get the bless your heart face. The like, oh, that's nice. That's so nice. I'm glad you enjoy that. And that it's clear that they don't expect it to go anywhere. And I think that was my big moment where I thought I could let them think that. I still remember telling certain very influential people in my work that I wrote a novel and seeing the bless your heart, just the Southern bless your heart in their eyes. And I thought, okay, this is the moment where I can believe them and think this is not going to go anywhere, or I can totally prove them wrong and take this somewhere else. And that was where I had to make that moment. And I think sometimes we get caught up in that and thinking, well, who am I? And that's true. Who was I? Who in the world was I to publish a book? And I was a hot mess when I started anyway. So it doesn't really matter how you start, but everybody has a chance. And so to this day, when people say they've written a book, I do not bless their heart when they say it.
It's really interesting. And I think it really just like a beautiful way that you described that kind of phase of your life there, Jenny. And I think, I've talked to hundreds of Olympic athletes and professional athletes and TV stars and Grammy winners and best-selling authors like yourself and entrepreneurs who have an idea for a business and pursue it and achieve extraordinary success. And I feel like one of the through lines through almost every conversation is that every single one of those people encountered a moment or a group of people who kind of said, well, that's interesting, but don't you realize that like only a few people get to go to the Olympics, or it's very unlikely that you're going to be a successful musician? And all of these individuals who've achieved some measure of success in any of these disciplines make that decision that you made to tune out the people that doubt them and choose to believe in themselves, and also believe in the people that, if there are a few people that support them and believe them and kind of help them push them on that path. And I sometimes wonder about all the success stories that we would hear about if people had made those decisions, right? Nobody is born a best-selling author. Everybody publishes their first book and then either has success right away or goes on to have success later on. So I think it's a really, really powerful story. Was not just specific to this endeavor, have you always been somebody who's kind of been a little bit intrigued about the idea of proving doubters wrong? Or is that a through line
No.
through your life or no?
In fact, I mean, serving other people is like my love language, right? So like I would rather take a back seat and do what's expected of me and serve people. So, when my parents wanted me to do a certain thing or they wanted me to go a certain path, I did it. No questions asked. And so I wasn't a major risk taker ever. And so, really, this was sort of that first moment where I was forced to decide whether or not to go inward inside me to find out who I was or to listen to everyone else. And I still to this day don't know what it was that caused me to do that, apart from the fact that I have a natural sense of my own creativity. I have a natural sense of that. And I think that when people question that, because that is who I am, you could question my teaching because that's not really who I am. So I'll do what you say. But when you question who I am at the root, the creative, that is me, that I think is the only reason I listened to myself, because I thought, well, you don't know what I'm thinking in my head. And maybe I won't, but I won't know unless I try.
Very well said, Jenny. And I think there's countless of examples, I think, that many of us can recall where you can kind of see the puzzle pieces coming together in your mind, but it's hard to ensure that people on the outside of your brain can see the puzzle pieces coming together. And I think it's your story, and we'll continue to get into more and more of it. But I think your story is just such a powerful reminder of the idea of believing in yourself and believing in that you know what's best for you. And it's important to take advice and outside counsel, but at some point you have to look yourself in the mirror and say, I can do this. And I think that's such an important part of your story and so many success stories. So after that first book that, you said barely saw the light of day, that, you handed to a few friends, everything changed when you wrote Coming Home for Christmas in 2013, became a huge hit, eventually a Hallmark original movie. I'm curious, Jenny, let's kind of break this down into like the period of writing it, and then shortly after it was published. While you were writing it, did something feel different? Did you feel like you were writing something that was going to become beloved by so many?
No, I had no idea. I mean, as an educator, I just naturally educate myself. So the first book was a complete disaster, in my opinion. And I've never gone back to it to look at it to let you know if it was or wasn't. But I had learned from that book to Coming Home for Christmas, I had read a lot and learned a lot. And even still now, 25, 27 books later, I can look back on those early books and I want to hide under my desk because I'm mortified that people are reading them because they don't showcase my most recent learning. And so there was no, oh, I've got it now, I can do it. It was just like, let me just take this next step. Everything that I did and continue to do is just baby steps, baby steps, baby steps. That's the only way that I can move forward. So never once, and still to this day, do I say, okay, I've hit that moment. I know what I'm doing. I never know what I'm doing.
Yeah. I think that's another through line in a lot of the conversation that comes out in a lot of the conversations I have with high performers in high performers in general, is that they never feel like they've reached the mountaintop.
No.
It's terrifying to kind of start the odometer back at zero and set out anew, whether it's creating a new album or writing a new book or beginning training for the next Olympic Games. But at the same time as it is terrifying, that you thrive in it. You thrive in kind of restarting and taking on a new challenge. And like you said, taking on those little itty bitty steps. What was the biggest, like you talked about, you went on this journey where you started studying other authors, you started reading books about writing and different resources like that. Was there one thing in particular that you took from that first book to Coming Home for Christmas that you really felt like played a role in helping you shape that story?
There wasn't one thing. What I thrive in is discussion. So once I was under a publisher, I got to have conversations with editors about story. And while I could read all day long, what's really cool with an editor is they're actually working with your book, with your story. So, I mean, they're kind of like children. Every story has its own set of challenges because you're working in a totally different storyline. But I continued to learn from each and every edit, and I listened to everything they said. So that then over the course of my career, while my early books to me are not as strong, they were a stepping stone to get where I am now. And I guarantee you, in 25 more books, I'll look back on these and think the same thing, because you can't fit all the learning in the world into one story. And that's why I tell my authors now is compare yourself. If you find a best-selling author you like that's like you, compare your book to their first book or their fifth book. Don't compare yourself to their 40th book, because that's impossible to reach. So learning from the editors, I think, was still more of those baby steps, but that was my favorite part and what got me the farthest in writing.
That's such an important lesson to put a pin in here. This idea of when you're looking at others in your industry who have kind of quote unquote made it and trying to draw comparisons and learn from them, look at their early work.
Yeah.
Because that's when they're at the starting gate in a similar stage to where you're at. And again, like these lessons apply, they transcend industries and disciplines, right? It's the same thing. You look at an Olympic figure skater landing a jump in a gold medal winning program, go back to what their skating program looked like in the early days, maybe their first Olympics or their first, international competition. And that's maybe a more realistic kind of benchmark for you to set and try and compare yourself to, even though the comparison game is always a challenge. Well, you alluded to it there. I want to get into the whole idea of Harpeth Road. You talked about, a few minutes ago, I made a note that you talked about service to others being like your love language. And that's something, no matter how much success you have in writing, this idea of serving others is something that's always a through line for you. And I don't think, anything is more emblematic than founding and leading your own publishing company, which you're doing now, not only writing and publishing your own books, but lifting up other authors in the genre and other genres. So let's talk about that. I mean, I guess it's kind of obvious what led you to start the publishing house is service to others, but more specifically, take me through that idea and that moment. What was kind of the compelling reason for you to do that? Not something that all authors do by any stretch of the imagination.
I know. I'm kind of weird, in fact, because a lot of authors are like, I don't want to have anything to do with all of that. So I had two specific moments in my career that led to this. The first was as a brand new author, I tried for about 2 years to get a publisher to pick me up, and I didn't know what I didn't know. So while I was willing to learn and willing to grow, I wasn't quite, in my opinion, ready for major publishing, right? I just don't think I was there. So I ended up with a startup publisher based in London who put in so much work into me that I grew quickly and listened to everything. And so I got that shot at a startup publisher. But in the same vein, I'm thinking as an author, that's great because it was a very collaborative environment. But I also got to work directly under the CEO of the publishing company while he was a startup, who happened to be a marketer. And I learned how to be an author from a marketer. And that set aside, my grandfather was a marketer. He was the director of marketing, and my grandmother was an artist. And the two together, I swear I only have their genetics, those two people in my family. And so working under this startup, one, I learned the startup. Of course, I didn't see everything because I was on the author side of things, but it stuck to me because I got it. I totally got it. And then as I moved forward and that startup grew by leaps and bounds and was eventually bought out by Hachette, which I think is the third largest publisher in the world, I continued on. And as my career continued, I got more and more buzzy. I wanted to hang out with my publishing team. I wanted to sit around their table and talk about why they chose the packaging for my books and why they went with this particular title and what kind of SEO they were doing and the keywords they were choosing. And I really wanted to hang out with them versus other authors. And so I got to a point where I would write. And when their package was different than my creative vision for the package, I wanted to tell them and hang out with them and say, but this is what I'm thinking. And as you know, that is the publisher's job, to package your story and to sell your story and to market your story. So when 2020 hit, everything shut down and my kids' baseball practice stopped and soccer practice stopped and we couldn't go anywhere. And I was stuck in my house. And at that moment, I had so much extra time that I decided to try to publish a book with what I thought would be a cool strategy. And again, baby steps. I didn't know what I didn't know. And I figured if I do it and it flops, I'll be quiet and I'll just go back to writing. But it might just be what I was meant to do. So I put out that book in 2020 and it ended up hitting the #1 clean and wholesome romance new release on Amazon.com. And that's when I said, okay, I think I've got something. And like everything else, it just baby steps, just everything. I'm still learning and I'm still working, but I'm following that creative seed that is within me that has led me here.
There's creatives, and then there's people like you, Jenny, which I feel like just take creative to a whole other level, right? I mean, many would say simply writing novels is creative enough. And you've taken it to a whole other level where you want to kind of have your hands and into every component of the process because you have a vision and you believe in that vision. And that's kind of, I think, where all this kind of like where it all kind of comes back to for you. So I want to go back a few minutes. You said you kind of looked at it and said, you know what, if this flops, I just go back to what I was doing, right? I mean, that's another thing I think that people often forget is that we assume that more people are going to see our mistakes and our missteps than actually do, right? I'm always reminded of a conversation on the podcast that I had with Jim Sonnefeld. He goes by Sony. He's the drummer in Hootie and the Blowfish. And for everybody listening who's not familiar with Hootie and the Blowfish, one of the most iconic rock bands of all time. They've sold over 25 million records, won 2 Grammys, have had an extraordinary run of success. And then Darius Rucker even went on to have his own incredible run of success as a solo country artist. But Sony told me this amazing story in one of our 2 conversations on the podcast. He said, in the early days, we were taking these gigs, all over South Carolina. And we drove 3.5 hours for a gig and 3 people showed up. And he said, this was before the days of social media. And he said, you know what, Andrew? The bad news was that 3 people showed up and we drove 3.5 hours. The good news was only us and those 3 people knew that 3 people showed up. And he said, so the next day we just dusted ourselves off and we kept going. And eventually everything changed and our trajectory changed. I think there's a lot I think there's an important lesson in that, not overstating like what's going to happen if you flop. You have to take chances.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. And I think there are 2 things I tell my kids. One is that failure is fake. If failure were real, none of us would eat with a spoon or walk down the sidewalk, because when we were babies, we fell down and we hurt ourselves. And it just takes practice. And you can do anything you want to do if you have enough practice, within the idea that the stuff you want to do is going to be what's inherently within your gut. Like, I'm probably not going to be an Olympic swimmer. I'm 5 feet tall and not the build, but that's not what's within me anyway, because what's within you is what's going to lead you in your path. And so I tell them, one, that failure is just not even real. And also that I never think about those missteps because I'm too busy being 10 steps ahead on my next steps. So I don't care if I mess up, because all that did was inform me of what to do for the next 10 steps that I'm taking. So I don't really ever see failure. As a former educator, I think failure is taught to people in school because there's a time limit on getting them to learn the stuff. But at the end of the day, everyone can learn the stuff if you have enough time.
I couldn't agree more, Jenny. I really do believe that, I always say You either succeed or you learn.
Yeah.
There's no failure. And that's, it's actually that idea of being 10 steps ahead on the next thing already is something that I've heard from other authors. I remember asking a couple different authors about this idea. When you get that first bestseller, is there suddenly this newfound pressure when you're working on your next book? And they said, Andrew, that's not how it works. Like, I was already well into the next book and already had a first manuscript of the next book to my publisher. And so I didn't have any of that. I think there's something to that. Just always keep moving. When you stop and start like reflecting too much, I think you could end up in some analysis paralysis. Just keep moving. Always be a few steps ahead of yourself in many ways. I think that's really, really neat.
And pivot. My 10 steps, when I get to step 8, I might have to pivot 9 and 10 and change those again. And it's totally fine. It's that blank page that I mentioned earlier. That's what I see it as. So I'm always at a blank page, deciding what I want to fill it with.
Biggest difference, Jenny, between kind of working through your own novels and helping other authors work through theirs?
It's a lot easier to see what other authors are doing. It's a lot easier to say, oh, well, you should start with this beginning, or, oh, well, what if you took it this way? Or what if you, than when you're doing it yourself because you think you've got it yourself. I always say, I think it's the best I can do because I wouldn't have written it if it wasn't. So it's easier to have an objective eye with someone else's work than it is with my own. But that being said, I mean, my editors, I literally listen to everything they say because that's their objective eye.
How do you you listen to everything that they say, and then, but how do you, do you have a mechanism kind of in your own mind, or like this feel of like, how do you filter out, again, like you have this extraordinary self-belief and conviction in your own abilities, but you also have this ability to take in data and information from other people. How do you decide what to act on versus what not to act on?
I think it's having a handle on my own strengths. So, for instance, I know that my strength is not to be an editor. I'm better at big picture creative, right? So, if I know that my strength is not to be an editor, then when I get an editor, first of all, I pick the very best ones that there are. I look at all the editors and work with them first to see how they interact with me and my stories before I put them on to an author, if I can. I mean, now we're kind of growing and I have to take people that I don't have that many books. I can't write that fast. But I think just knowing my own strengths and then allowing people with strengths that are different than mine to take control. And I think that's just sort of leadership in general, is allowing people to lean on their own strengths and accepting that. So those editors, I don't edit. I'm not great at it. I feel like it's stressful to me to do it. So if I get a great editor, I'm going to listen to them 100%.
Very, very well said, Jenny. As we get ready to wrap up our conversation today, I'm curious, all the growth that you've had, you talked about 20 books from now, you're going to be looking back on these books and wishing you did things differently. What do you think, if you had to distill it down on one thing, what's still what's one big area of growth for you professionally as a writer that you're still working on?
Oh, gosh. There's not just one. It's everything. I mean, it's just taking, I just wrote a blog post on first lines. I spent an hour on my first line of my book because that's the line that's going to make people decide whether they want to read the next line. And so something as simple as your first line, to plot development, to character arcs, it's always tweaking and making it as realistic as possible. I write very clean, sort of Hallmarky style stories. So trying to make that believable when and I know that in our real world, that's not always how it goes. So how do you make that? How do you make the fairy tale believable? There's so many moving parts to it, and I'm always learning.
Jenny, well, I have really enjoyed our time together today. I have learned so much from you, and I know we all can continue to learn so much from you and from watching the journey that you're continuing on here. I can probably speak for millions of people out there who've read or watched your work, and we're all grateful for that friend of yours in college who planted that seed in your mind that one day you could be an author. And I'm sure everybody who's read your work and watched your work is also grateful that you believed in yourself enough to pursue that path, that little seedling that your college sorority sister planted in your mind. So, and there's no question that the way you've gone about your work is with an extraordinary work ethic, dedication to your craft, continuous learning, and then with the publishing, lifting other people up, which is a cornerstone of the everybody pulls the tarp mindset. So Jenny, there is no question in my mind, you are a certified tarp puller. You're forever a part of our everybody pulls the tarp community here. Thank you so much for spending some time with me this week. All right.
Thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for joining me this week. Be sure to subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you can catch all of our upcoming episodes. And if you are like me and want a world full of tarp pullers, then leave a review to help others find us. You can also follow me on Twitter at Andrew H. Moses. That's Andrew H. Moses. And be sure to sign up for my email newsletter at everybodypullsthetarp.com/newsletter. I'll share tips and insights to help you achieve maximum success and happiness. Today is a great day to pull the tarp. I am rooting for you. See you next time.